So we're looking today at the fact that, sometimes life is unfair. Do you ever feel like that? Yeah, we used to go away with our kids camping in Tuscany every year, and we'd do all the stuff, go to the beach, swim in the pool, eat, chill out, lay in the hammock. And every night we'd come back, we'd have dinner, and then it would be games. My family they love games. And their favourite game was actually my worst game that I hated, and it was Ludo. Give me a wave if you know what Ludo is. You got the 4 counters, and first, before you even get the counter out, you've got to get a 6. That's the first thing, isn't it? I had this little thing I just kept saying, like if you speak to the dice, it would happen. I used to go, clickety-clicks, give me a 6. 2. Clickety-clicks, give me a 6. 1. It would take forever for me to get my pieces, but the rest of my family, I would get 6s after 6s. They'd be going around the board, getting home. Finally, I'd get a counter out. And I'd be running all the way around the board. I'd get just close to the end, and then someone would land on me. You know what happens when someone lands on you? Yeah, I have to go all the way back. Here we go. Clickety-clicks, give me a 6. It used to take about 3 hours. Every night I endured Ludo, and it felt like everybody else was out to get me. There were games when I finished where everybody else was out. I still had 4 counters in the flipping garage. And sometimes we can feel like life's out to get us, like people are out to get us. We go into things that it's not our fault. It's nothing that we've done, and suddenly we're in a situation we think, this just isn't fair. I was reading an article the other day about Stan Lee. It's a great name, isn't it? And of course, he's done he's Marvel, isn't he? So he's done like the Incredible Hulk and that one with that man that gets shrunk. He's an Ant-Man that's out at the moment, isn't it? He's done the Hulk. He's done Spider-Man. And they were interviewing him and saying, look, there's loads of, sci-fi writers out there. There's loads of action writers out there. Why do you think it is, Stan? And of course, he's in all of them, isn't he? It's his movie. Why not? He pops in at some point. They said, why is it that your movies are so popular? And he said, well, do you know what? When I was writing my movies, I was thinking, what would it really be like if these superheroes were real? And they had this superhero life and the normal life. What would they really be like? And he said, I focused on the fact that actually they would just be like normal people. They would have acne. They would struggle with social awkwardness. They would all kinds of problems. You think about Spider-Man. He's got amazing super strength. He can spin a web. He can swing from building to building. He's got super strength, super hearing, all of that. But when what's his name? Peter Parker, right? He's socially awkward. He's awkward with women. He's terrible at relationships. He can't hold a job down. His boss is always ragging on him. And, you've got this on the one hand, flying across the city, getting all the criminals, webbing them up, all of that. And then on the other hand, he's got this social thing. And so often in life, we've got great strength and great things going on here and amazing things happening over here. Yet something else over here is really bad and totally unrelated. And you're thinking, why, if this is going on in my life, am I having to face this? And we can fall into the trap of thinking that God is amazing because he is. Thinking that once we've found Jesus Christ, our past is washed away. God has a great plan in the future. And from now on, nothing is ever going to go wrong ever again. But it's just not like that, is it? We're living with all the great things that God is doing, and yet we have to deal with things going over here. Maybe, you lose your job, or you don't get that promotion and someone else gets it. You've worked hard, you deserve it, but they get it because, the boss is married to their sister. Or maybe, a relationship breaks down and it wasn't your fault. Maybe you're having to deal just when your life is starting to take up, you're having to deal with a sickness or an infirmity or there's a death in the family. And we ask ourselves, why me? Why has this happened to me? What have I done wrong? And it's not fair. And I want to give you today 2 focuses, 2 mindsets, 2 keys, if you like, to help you process through issues when you feel like something that happens and it's not fair. So if we want to turn to John chapter 21. And we're going to get it up on the screen behind me. Is it coming on the screen? Fantastic. So, after breakfast, it's a good time of the day, that, isn't it? After breakfast. I like that. Let's just stop and talk about that. No, we can't. After breakfast, Jesus asked Simon, Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, Peter replied. You know I love you. Then feed my lambs, Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, Peter said, you know that I love you. Then take care of my sheep, Jesus said. And a third time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt that Jesus asked him the question a third time. And he said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, then feed my sheep. I tell you the truth. When you were young, you were able to dress and do as you liked. You dressed yourself and went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and others will dress you and take you to where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to let him know by what kind of death he would glorify God. And then Jesus told him, follow me. Peter turned around and saw behind him the disciple Jesus loved, the one who had leaned over to Jesus during the supper and asked, Lord, who will betray you? And Peter asked Jesus, well, what about him, Lord? And Jesus replied, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? As for you, follow me. So in this, just to give you a little bit of context of the passage, to unpack that, and then we're going to get to the 2 things of how to get through when you feel like you've been treated in a way that's not fair. So here they are. Jesus has been crucified. He's risen from the dead. And for most of the disciples, this is the first time that they see the risen Jesus. And they're out and they're fishing, and Jesus calls out to them. They've been fishing all night. They've caught nothing. And he says, throw the nets on the other side. And as they do that, they caught so many fish that their nets burst. You know, that's part of why we call the church Net Church. We're throwing the nets on the other side to reach people. But anyway, they were there all night. They caught so much fish, and they saw an absolute miracle. They saw the power of the resurrected Christ. And then, you know, they come in with a fish and they have breakfast with Jesus. Wow, that's another sermon, isn't it? I'd love to preach that today, having breakfast with Jesus. But they had breakfast with Jesus, and then, you know, the main kind of topic of this is all about Simon Peter. And as you know, when Jesus was crucified, Simon 3 times was asked, do you know Jesus? And 3 times he denied him. And so here they are, they've seen this amazing miracle, and then Jesus sits down with Simon Peter. And, you know, before we talk about fairness, before we talk about truth, we've got to look at it in the context of God's grace. God's love and favour that you don't deserve, but he gives it to you anyway. Before we even think about things that happen that maybe are not fair or are not right or we feel hard done by, we've got to just quickly have a look at this whole thing of grace. That we've all done things wrong. We've all sinned. We've all made mistakes. Some of us have done bad things, worse things than others. Others have done less things. But we've all done things that we know that we shouldn't. I was watching a program with the atheist Ann Landers. She's a famous atheist. And she was having a debate with a couple of other Christians around the room, an American commentator, and it was getting pretty heated and they were going for it. And then it kind of cooled down for a bit, and Ann looked at these other 2 Christians and she said, the one thing I admire about your faith is forgiveness. She says, For me, when I need forgiveness, there is no one I can go to get it from. And here's the thing, that God is a God of grace, he's a God of forgiveness, and Simon, as he denied Jesus 3 times and Jesus was crucified, here he is seeing him after that. It's always awkward when you've done something to somebody, isn't it? And you know you've hurt them and you know you've upset them and suddenly you're in the room in front of them. You're like, oh, this is difficult. This is awkward. And he's feeling awkward. He's feeling difficult. And instead of Jesus condemning him, instead of Jesus coming down hard on him, he says, Simon, do you love me? Because he did love Jesus. And sometimes love isn't enough, is it? Sometimes it doesn't matter how much we love someone, our own human nature gets the better of us and we end up doing things that we didn't want to do, saying things that we didn't want to say. And Simon says, yes, Jesus, of course I love you. He said, then feed my sheep. And a second time, Simon, do you love me? Lord, you know I love you. Then feed my sheep. And a third time. Do you know why Jesus asked him a third time? Because Peter denied Jesus 3 times. 3 times Jesus answers that. And instead of condemning him, he forgives him. And he says, do you know what? I'm going to give you a purpose for life. You're valuable to me. You're worth something to me. You may have let me down, but I'm a God of grace and I forgive you. You know, everything you've done, it's not wasted. You haven't messed it up. There's a future for you. And he restores Peter. And I'm sure Peter is now, you know, the guilt that he's carrying, the problems that he's carrying, the emotional trauma that he's carrying, you know, of betraying Jesus and seeing Jesus crucified. And now, you know, he sees God come and he sees a great miracle and he's been forgiven. He's been washed. He's been put back in a right relationship. I'm sure he's now thinking, oh, this is amazing. You know, all of that was traumatic and difficult, but God has forgiven me. God's given me a purpose. And I bet he's feeling like, wow, this Christian life, this Net Church stuff is brilliant. And then Jesus says to him, when you were young, you did what you wanted to do. You dressed in what you want to dress in. But when you're older, someone else is going to dress you and they're going to lead you where you don't want to go. And of course, he is talking about Peter's death. He is saying, Peter, you're going to be executed for me. Imagine that, knowing how your life is going to end. You know, I don't know how you want to die. Somebody once said, I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens. And I kind of get that. Let me be asleep. I don't want to die in the winter and miss the summer. Yeah, I want to go to the end of the summer. It's autumn. The last day of the sunshine, I want to go to bed happy and wake up in eternity. I don't know if that's going to happen. But Jesus says to Peter, listen, this is how you're going to die. You're going to be executed for your faith. Nobody wants to hear that, do they? And so Peter, you know, in all the joy of everything that's happening and in the fact that he's been forgiven and he's seen the power of God, he now has to live with this understanding that something bad is going to happen to him. Something bad is going to happen to him. And you know, when things happen that we feel are unfair or we feel are not right, we can obsess and continue to think about those things, can't we? And you know, Peter does the same thing that we would do. You know, God's got a great plan for him and Jesus restores him and they're going on this great walk and he tells him, it's going to happen. You're going to be executed. And what does he do? He turns around and he looks at John. And he thinks, hang on a minute. Why is this happening to me? What about him? You know, what about him? What's going to happen to him? Let's push John under the bus. Yeah, why do I get that? And what's going to happen to him? You better tell me he's going to get executed too. Otherwise, I'm not going to be very happy. And Jesus basically says to him, mind your own business. He actually shows his sovereignty, that he has a different purpose and a different plan for each and every one of us here. He's got one plan for me and he's got one plan for you. And I'm not going to question God and say, God, why have I got to do this? I'm just going to trust him that he's got a plan for me and he knows what's best for me. And let me give you my two perspectives on this. When we go through things and we think, why is it not happening to them? Why is it happening to me? We can obsess. We can go over and over that. We can have a pity party and, just be miserable and down. But there are two things that Jesus tells Peter in this. And the first thing is this: feed my sheep. Here's something for you to focus on, Peter. That might be happening over there, but this is what I want you to focus on. Feed my sheep. Feed my sheep and feed my sheep. In other words, be a pastor. Be a pastor. And when we go through stuff in life, we can look at the problems, we can look at the difficulties. Peter could have just looked at what's going to happen and run away, but Jesus says this: you've got a purpose, you've got a calling. It might be tough, but don't look at the problems, don't look at the issues. Focus on what I have called you to do, and you're going to get through the other side. I don't know if you've ever had days where you're at work and it's difficult and you thought, do you know what? Maybe it's time to have a look. Maybe I could do something else. This is too hard. So you have a little look through the job things. You see what jobs are out there. Anybody ever had days like that? You're in work, it's difficult. You think, do you know what? This is too hard. I think I might do something else. Let me tell you, you're not the only ones. Yeah? There have been times where it's been a bit tough and I thought, do you know what, God, this is a bit too much now. It's just too much. And, I remember one time I was thinking, this is too hard. I wonder what else I could do. Because, what could I do with my qualifications? So I had a little look. And I saw that the Metropolitan Police were recruiting. And I thought, I could do that. I could run around London catching criminals. I could do that. That looks quite fun. So I looked down at what they were looking for and the qualifications. I thought, yeah, I got those. And they were taking people up to the age of 54, I think. And they were saying, we don't necessarily just want young people. We are looking for people who've got experience in the community, in working in community. And I thought, I could do that. I've been in the prison. I've been working with families in all kinds of issues. And I'm thinking in my mind that I'm going to go there. I'm going to go to the interview. They're going to see my qualifications. They're going to hear about everything I've done in the community. And they're going to say to me, Roy, you're exactly what we've been looking for. Here's a uniform. Now go and nick somebody. And then I read down and it said, we do our own sight tests and our own hearing tests. And the bubble began to burst. They were looking for people with 20/20 vision. And that's a problem, really, isn't it? Because if you're in the police, you need to see well. People say to me, Roy, it's amazing, you don't have notes. And I said, that's because I can't see them. Can you imagine in the police force? Which way did he go, Roy? What did he say? So it kind of burst that bubble of me running around and in a flashy car chasing. Apart from the fact I can't run very fast and I'll get out of breath anyway. And let's face it, with these little legs, I ain't catching anybody. They'd have to give me a dog. That's the only chance I've got. But here's the thing. I was never called to be a policeman. I was never called to be a businessman, an ice cream salesman, whatever else is out there. God called me to be a leader of the church. He called me to preach the gospel. And when things are tough and difficult, you've got to come back to what God has called you to do. Peter could have done so many things, but when we look at his life, when we look at what he achieved, he was the leader of the early church. He led the apostles. He traveled through Palestine, through Asia Minor. He preached to hundreds of thousands of people. He saw and did countless miracles. It was Peter who stood up at the start of the early church, ahead above everybody else on the day of Pentecost, and solidified his leadership as he spoke to the crowds. He has written, and we have his letters in the New Testament. Peter, through his whole life, instead of focusing on what he thought was bad and why is this going to happen to me, he focused on what Christ had called him to do, and he led his life full of success and meaning and the power of God. And then, 30 years later, when he was martyred for his faith, as Jesus said, his death gave glory to God. And we read about it. And when we read, the early church fathers, Augustine, Hippo, and Clement, they talk about the fact that when they get there, and I'm not talking about Clement from Croydon. Those of you that know Clement. When he got there, he was ready. He was prepared to face whatever God had laid before him. And I want to tell you today, God has got a purpose and a calling for you. And in times when it's difficult, in times when it's tough, in times when you think that it's hard and it's not fair and you can't go on, those are the times when you need to hear from Jesus for yourself. That's when you need to hear him saying, keep doing what you're doing. Feed my sheep. Reach the lost. Build the church. Whatever it is he's calling you to do, it's those moments when we hold on to those things that keeps us going on and going through. And the second thing that Jesus says to Peter twice is this. The first time when he's told about the difficulty he's going to go through, Jesus says this, follow me. Follow me. When he looks at John and says, what about his life? Why have I got to go through that? And he's not going to go through that. This is what Jesus says, follow me. When we feel like it's not fair, when we don't know why things are happening, we've just got to fix our eyes on Jesus and knuckle down and know that he's got our back. He's got our future. He's got our eternity. He's got our healing. He's got our provision. He's got our health. He's got our direction. He's got our joy. And just fix our eyes on him. Thank you. We can't follow our feelings. Feelings are there. Feelings are great. But how many of you know that you never make decisions out of a place of feelings? I like to watch a lot of these psychology and relationship podcasts and things on YouTube. And one of the ones I was watching the other day, where they were talking to some psychologists, they were talking about, relationships, because I need help, And so here's the thing. And he said this: never have a conversation or send a text in anger. Oh, that's great advice, isn't it? And, if you're a leader here today, if you want to grow in leadership, if you want to be a good husband, a good wife, if you want to grow in relationships, never speak or act out of emotion. You always leave space. Calm down. Think about it. Process it. Decide what you're going to do. Pray about it. See what God says, and then go back. If you're fearful and you're afraid to challenge someone, to deal with something, to go into work, to face what you've got to think, you don't make a decision when you're in a place of fear. What you do is you go speak to somebody. You get some courage. You hear from God. You work yourself into a strong place. You overcome your fear, and then you act. If you've been upset, if you've been hurt, you never make a decision out of that place. You get some healing. You go to God. You get some counseling. You process it through. And when you're in a good place and you know what God's telling you to do and you follow the word, then you make that decision. You don't follow your feelings. You follow Jesus. Peter was an emotional kind of guy. And I loved that. I love the rawness of Peter, that, on the 1 minute he's saying something that's great and the next minute he's completely messing it up. But I think the reason that Peter's life was so successful, the reason that he got through so many of those challenges, the reason that he continued to love God, reach people, see churches grow, even though he knew that something terrible was going to happen at the end, was because of these things. Because he followed his calling and he followed Jesus. Before I finish, I'm going to ask Terry just to come up and share some of the things that she's experienced. God help her through in times when things have not seemed fair.
Thanks, Roy. I'm sure that everyone in this room would be able to come and stand on the stage and share a moment when they felt like life's not fair. But for me, as I was thinking about it this week, I was thinking there's been so many scenarios in life where I've felt like that. But if I think back to 2016, just a little bit before that, my parents had split up, so I hadn't had contact with my mum for about 3 years. I'd had a child in that time, and it was a horrible season of my life. In 2016, I reconciled with my mum. She came back to church. She'd always been in church, but she'd gone away for that period of time. So she'd come back to church. I was youth pastor. I had 2 beautiful girls at the time. I was married, happily married. And out of nowhere, Mum got diagnosed with cancer. Not any cancer, stage 4 terminal cancer. It was Christmas 2016. It was horrific. We got through Christmas. She had surgery in the January. She had to have a mastectomy. She was on her own because she'd left my dad. So me and my sister took it in turns to be with her, to stay with her. We had to do everything for her, care for her. And at that time I was a pastor, like I said, so I was youth pastor. And I remember just thinking, God, why? I lost my mum. She's back and I'm about to lose her again. And it was painful and it was horrible and it was such a hard season. And I remember specifically, I was just thinking of it just now, this one evening I'd had to inject my mum with the drugs that she needed to keep her alive for a bit longer. And I had a phone call from someone in church whose husband had just left the house and was going to commit suicide, and she was distraught. And I had a choice to make, like I'm in this situation with my mum at her flat. I'd just given her injection, and so I quickly made up her bed, I put her to bed, and I rushed out to go and sit with this lady. And as I was driving there, I was like, God, you've got to give me something. Because every day I'm doing chemotherapy with my mum, I'm taking her to hospital. I was exhausted. I was still youth pastor, so I was preaching on a Friday night, driving to my mum's house, looking after my kids. It was a hard season. I just remember being in my car before I got to this lady's house and being like, God, you have got to help me because this is unfair. You could have sent someone else, but I'm here in this moment and I need you to do something. And I sat with this woman, her husband came home, they're still married, he's fine. And I just in that season remember thinking, God, I can't deal with this. And a few months into Mum's treatment, so she'd had her surgery, she'd had chemotherapy, and she was about to start radiotherapy. And I fell pregnant with my 3rd child. And we were overjoyed. We felt like in this season of darkness and hardship, it was looking like Mum was going to get better. She still had the cancer at that time, but the treatment looked like it was working. We found out that it had actually spread to her lymph nodes, which, for cancer, that's not good. That means it is likely to have spread around her body. And I fell pregnant. And this was like a little ray of hope. It was like God had given us this little bit of hope to just keep going. And 4 weeks later, I had a miscarriage. That was probably the darkest moment of my life. I remember sitting on my sofa. Jaya was just holding me. And I was just like, why? God, why? This is so unfair. well, I thought that this was a gift from you, and now that's gone too. And I just remember God dropping into my heart, I am good. I'm good. You've got to trust me, I'm good. So I carried on doing youth pastor. I would see kids get saved on a Friday night. It was incredible. I saw kids getting filled with the Holy Spirit, and I walked this journey of just trusting that God was good. A few weeks later, Mum had her last radiotherapy and she got the all clear. She's completely beaten cancer. She's still cancer-free now. And then a couple of weeks after that, I fell pregnant with my gorgeous daughter, Faith. And God was faithful. He restored everything that had been taken. But since that moment, no matter what happens, when life feels unfair, I just have to hold on to that truth that God is good, no matter what the situation looks like.
It's real. It's real. And Jesus came to earth, to where we are, to understand our struggles, to understand our difficulties, but he came to take us to the other side, to take us through. And I want to just end today just reminding you of what Jesus told Peter. Keep doing what God's called you to do. And keep your eyes on Jesus. Let me pray for you right now. Maybe you are here and you are facing something very difficult right now. And sometimes, when you're speaking into other people's lives, when you see a situation from outside, it's very easy to know what to do. But when you're in the middle of it, it's very hard sometimes to know where to go, who to turn to, what decision to make. If that's you today, I just want to pray for you that as you go from this place, that Jesus himself is going to speak to you. He's going to lead you. He's going to guide you. And as you keep your eyes on him, as you keep doing what you're called to do, God is going to take you through the other side and he is going to prosper you. And that which you seem is there to bring you harm is going to be turned around and it's going to bring good. Let's close our eyes together, shall we? Father, I pray today for each and everybody here. And I pray, Lord, for those right now who are struggling with issues that are weighing them down and are burdening them. They don't think are fair and are struggling to know what to do. Father, I pray that you would speak to them, that you would send your word, that you would encourage them as you encouraged Peter. Help them to keep their eyes on you. Fill them with your Holy Spirit. Give them your grace and your strength. And Lord, I prophesy, you will see them through the other side in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.